While many of us have grown up immersed in the common sense belief that economic growth is crucial for improving human well-being and seeking abundance, throughout modern history, radical voices have consistently popped up to reject this premise. In this video, we will look at 7 key arguments showing that it is, in fact, the pursuit of economic growth which undermines human and ecological security and well-being. In the book, The Future is Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism, the authors undertake this useful task of exploring distinct critiques of economic growth. They're worth examining here to gain a fair insight into the arguments, often built upon deep scientific and political analysis, put forward by degrowth advocates and others. So, first and foremost, we have the Ecological Critique. The Ecological Critique asserts that economic growth destroys the ecological foundations of human life and cannot be transformed to become sustainable. The key mantra here is that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet, and that the economy, as a subset of nature's physical and biological processes, must abide by the laws of physics. This critique lies at the heart of the degrowth movement, underpinned by evidence showing that economic growth cannot simply be greened by installing wind or solar power, or attached with fancy qualifiers such as smart or qualitative growth. Rather, as we have discussed elsewhere on this channel, there is no scientific evidence that growth can be decoupled from ecological harm at anything like the pace or scale needed to address the ecological crisis. Instead, a growth-oriented capitalist system seems intent on converting nature into private profit at ever-increasing rates. The ecological critique of growth has a long lineage in history, but has really been at the core of radical ecology movements since the 1970s, predating the modern degrowth movement as we know it today. This is something that we will look at in more depth elsewhere. Number 2, the Socio-Economic Critique, which argues that economic growth mismeasures our lives and thus stands in the way of well-being and equality of all. While for much of the 20th century it was assumed that economic growth equated to some kind of societal progress or well-being, a consistent thread of thinkers have always questioned this. Indeed, the originator of the concept of GDP himself questioned its broad application for judging societal progress, arguing that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. Beyond some low base, growth does not actually improve lives, but can in fact harm them. As the authors of The Future is Degrowth write, based on a large number of empirical studies, this form of growth critique shows that the social and environmental costs of growth above a certain individual or societal income level are higher than its benefits. As an example of this, a rash of studies from the 20th and early 21st century, including famous works by the economist Richard Easterlin, demonstrated that beyond a certain basic level of national income, measures of happiness do not rise within societies across time. More recently, results from a study of 19 indigenous and small-scale societies, many of whom have little or no monetary income, reported life satisfaction on a par or exceeding the so-called wealthiest countries in the world. The study is linked in the description, and as the authors note, these results imply greater flexibility in the means to achieve happiness than are apparent from surveys that examine only industrialized societies. There are numerous causal factors we could examine here, but ultimately the implication is that instead of obsessing about growth, we can step back at a societal level and consider what ends we really want to achieve. Number 3, the Cultural Critique. The Cultural Critique notes that economic growth produces alienating ways of working, living, and relating to each other in nature. Cultural criticism of growth emerges from a diverse range of sources through history, from ecological humanism to existentialism to Western Marxism in the 60s and 70s. Cultural critics of growth variously argue that productivism and industrial modernity produce isolation, not just from the environment and the means of production, but from each other, resulting in cultural malaise and stagnation. In some cases, this idea of isolation is argued to derive from mainstream economics, which sees the human essence as being homo economicus, an isolated and self-interested actor or machine for simply maximizing their own utility. Influential cultural critics here range from Henry David Thoreau, E.F. Schumacher and Jane Jacobs, to Erich Fromm, Ivan Illich, and Wendell Berry, with many in between. A broad understanding of alienation is key here, whereby in a growth-oriented society, workers and society in general become tools and instruments, a means to profit rather than persons with their own telos and desires. Most recently, the term bullshit jobs has been used to describe how much labour under capitalism is perceived by the workforce itself as pointless, unnecessary, and ecologically destructive. And it is no wonder in the face of this alienation that we are seeing an epidemic of mental and physical illnesses in societies which demand growth at all costs. Number 4, critique of capitalism. The critique of capitalism notes that economic growth depends on and is driven by capitalist exploitation and accumulation. As the authors write, in a competitive market system, surplus value must largely be reinvested as capital, machinery, resources, labour, thus leading to expansion and the continued expanded reproduction of capital at ever higher levels. This is the famous money, commodities, more money cycle identified by Marx. Apart from the externalized exploitation of nature and colonized societies that this entails, out of this drive to accumulate and grow also come capitalism's continuous internal contradictions and crises. Individual social and ecological needs are only incidental to these processes and usually suffer with the growth of class inequality and capitalist power that we see around us today. Number 5, the Feminist Critique. The Feminist Critique asserts that economic growth is based on gendered overexploitation and devalues reproduction. In particular, the growth-based economic system is patriarchal in its overlooking and undervaluing of the vital reproductive labour shouldered mostly by women around the world. While the majority of labour that occurs in so-called capitalist societies is care and reproductive labour, such as caring for children and the elderly, cooking, housework, and repair work, this remains for the most part unrecognised and unpaid. Pioneering feminist economists such as Marilyn have therefore long criticised the biased constructions of GDP and growth and the genderless homo economicus which mainstream neoclassical economics rests upon. One famous representation of this, which the authors of The Future is Degrowth also draw from, is this iceberg diagram from the Community Economies Institute, which makes clear the diversity of activities which take place, often hidden below the surface, and ignored in comparison to wage labour and capitalist enterprise. A further aspect of this is the gendered exploitation which occurs even above the surface, with women and marginalised groups facing exploitation, discrimination, and subpar working conditions in a patriarchal, productivist growth economy. Number 6, critique of industrialism. The critique of industrialism notes that economic growth gives rise to undemocratic, productive forces and techniques. From this perspective, the complex webs of technologies through which capitalism is enacted and stretches across the globe are not neutral, but have dangerous and inherent side effects. The authors note that social philosophical works such as Lewis Mumford's Myth of the Machine, Jacques Ellul's La Technique, or Ivan Illich's Tools for Conviviality are often cited in this regard, not to mention the work of other countercultural thinkers such as E.F. Schumacher and André Gortz. Critiques of industrialism argue that, no matter the kind of ownership or social organisation, the development of productive forces and technology in modern societies have become authoritarian, alienating, and restrictive of self-determination, and therefore cannot automatically be regarded as desirable for an emancipatory society. Number 7, South-North Critique. Finally, arguing from a global justice perspective, the South-North Critique holds that economic growth relies on and reproduces relations of domination, extraction, and exploitation between capitalist centre and periphery. From the very emergence of capitalism, according to this perspective, growth in the centres has been based on neo-colonial appropriation, extractivist exploitation of nature, and the externalization of social and ecological costs. Countries which are peripheral to the power centres, particularly those in the global south, are systematically reduced to raw material suppliers, and, through various mechanisms, kept trapped in this position. Historically, this was done directly, through colonial relations and subjugation. In more recent decades, this took neo-colonial forms, such as inequitable global trade agreements, the concentration of power amongst multinational corporations, and structural adjustment programs. Since the middle of the 20th century, ideologies of development were imposed on the global south, replacing direct empires and ideas of projects of civilization. The absurdity of this notion of development has led in more recent years to many critical voices of the global south emerging under the umbrella of post-development. These thinkers seek a more egalitarian and ecological path to autonomy for the global south, and re-emphasize that a fixation on growth merely reinforces the dominance of the capitalist class in the core. The degrowth movement emerges then at the intersection of these 7 growth critiques. Much more can be said on each one, of course, and each critique has its own expansive lineage in history, often predating even the emergence of the term degrowth. This video merely skims the surface, and certainly not all who advocate a particular critique of growth would identify with the degrowth movement as we see it today. But they are important framings for how we start to conceive of more liberated and sustainable social orders. It is also important to look at these 7 critiques holistically, to ensure that post-growth discussions come from a broad and open-minded perspective, not one narrowly obsessed with just one aspect or critique. So that's it for this week. What do you think? Do you agree with how these critiques have been framed? Is a post-growth economy a necessity? Let me know what you think in the comments. And thank you for watching. If you'd like more on this and similar topics, have a look around the channel and subscribe to the Nowtopia newsletter linked to in the description.